The story over at The Reload is by contributing writer Jake Fogelman, who I have yet to meet or have on the show, but let's remind me to talk about that. I want to have
We
him
do
on.
need to do that.
And the title of the article is Hunter Biden Argues Gun Charges Unconstitutional and Push for Dismissal. And I called this novel, and you corrected me and said it's not really novel. Maybe it's ironic, but the idea that the president's wayward son, Hunter Biden, is now pushing this defense that, if it works, could potentially be beneficial to other people in this situation who may not necessarily be Biden voters.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would say that it's remarkable, right? Just because of the dynamics of who's involved. This president's son, the president himself is a very staunch gun control advocate who wants stricter gun laws. He wants more gun restrictions, not fewer. And his son is obviously now facing charges for lying on a background check in order to obtain a gun while being a unlawful user of drugs, specifically crack cocaine, which he got himself into this situation by basically writing a book and telling everyone that that's what he was doing at the time he had that gun. So there's a lot of remarkable things about this. And then, so that being charged alone is obviously going to be a news story. It's going to be a political story. But then now he is bringing up and he's actively making a Second Amendment defense to these charges that is not novel, which actually makes this story even more legitimate, right? And more of a real story. Like there's a lot, people make all kinds of legal arguments, or they'll bring up some legal argument and get a lot of attention, or and it may be a long shot thing. And it's not that this isn't a long shot thing necessarily, but it's something that is much more realistic today than it was 3 or 4 years ago, because of Bruin, right? The case that we just mentioned earlier, where the court established this new test for what kinds of laws are constitutional under the Second Amendment. And it's a test that's based on the history and tradition of firearms regulation in the United States, dating back to when the Second Amendment was written and adopted, right? That, this is the whole sort of concept of originalism, where they're trying to look at, well, what did people think the Second Amendment meant when they adopted it in 1792, right? So in order for a modern prohibition like this drug one from federal law, which really doesn't date back very far at all, it's from the mid 20th century, right? The 1960s, the Gun Control Act, right? And in order for that to be considered constitutional, you have to find some sort of analog around the founding period that addressed a similar problem in a similar way, right? For a similar reason. And that's where you've seen a lot of legal fights in the lower courts on this. And you actually have a case pending before the Supreme Court right now that the Department of Justice, President Biden's Department of Justice, has asked the court to review, called Daniels, which deals with somebody who was arrested for having marijuana and a gun. And so that's why this case actually becomes even more like a legitimate news story. It's not just the shocking nature of, oh, it's the president's son and he's, he's using these drugs and there's all this stuff around him that we don't need to get into everything, obviously, but that becomes a sort of, there's a lot of sensational aspects to that story, but there's really a core to this case that I think is kind of surprising in how legitimate it is, like how much attention we actually should probably pay to it, because US v. Biden, which is the name of this case, which is going to ramp up in 2024, which is when Joe Biden is running for re-election, has a legitimate chance of actually impacting Second Amendment jurisprudence in the United States.
Yeah, in a meaningful way as well.
Yeah.
So because if they decide, well, this law is unconstitutional for Hunter Biden or for Daniels or anyone else for that matter, could affect other people. Because I guarantee you, there are currently millions, at least hundreds of thousands of prohibited possessors out there because they use marijuana medically or recreationally and happen to have a gun in the house. They may not even be a big, quote unquote gun person, but technically you're committing a federal felony. Is it a felony? I think it's a felony, right?
Yeah, oh, it's a felony
felony
for
possession.
sure. Yeah,
Not
and you
felony
could be
possession,
charged
but
with multiple felonies. That's what happened to Hunter Biden, right? He's charged with 3 different felonies based off the same purchase. He's charged
right.
with possessing the gun as an unlawful drug user. He's charged with lying on the background check about being an unlawful drug user, and then he's charged with a third crime that's related to having the gun store owner, the FFL, the licensed dealer, um, retain this document that has a lie in it. Is this sort of the third? They're basically all the same
Right.
action, but you can get charged multiple times. I mean, he really kind of, the prosecutor here is, if you might recall, right, they initially had a plea deal set up. They had an arrangement that they were going to, and it all fell apart when they got to court and the judge started scrutinizing it, because it was this kind of strange deal that predicated the gun charges on the tax charges in a way that the judge had never seen done before. And when she started asking questions, the whole thing kind of fell apart
Yeah,
in
it
front of
kind of came
that.
down to like basically how much immunity he has for what sort of
Yeah,
charges, or something like that. I didn't
right.
pay that close attention, but I remember it being something to do with that.
Yeah. It was, and also had to do with like, if who determines whether or not he violated the plea, because
Yeah,
there's this component to where the judge would have to step in, and she wasn't comfortable with that she had the authority to even do that. And so, they put together this deal that just didn't make sense, I guess, once it got to actual court, and it fell apart. And so, and part of it was Hunter Biden and his lawyers saying, I guess the prosecutor must have felt that they didn't, he was upset by the deal falling apart, is what it seems like, and he kind of threw the book at Hunter in this case, which I'm sure that's something a lot of prosecutors will do in a lot of cases. If a deal falls apart, they're kind of like, all right, well,
we
we
tried.
tried, so
Yeah,
here's what you get instead. Now, I also think that means perhaps maybe they'll be able to come to some sort of agreement later on before this actually ends up in court. You can maybe talk about this. I think a lot of these federal cases, the vast majority of them end up with plea deals instead of going to court, right?
yeah. We were just talking about, who was I talking about this to? Um, Crikey, I can't remember, but the idea. Oh, I was on a seminar, a webinar with John last night for firearms legal protection, and we were discussing federal criminal cases and expert witnesses and investigators. And one of the things that came up was, you know, and this is my input to this conversation, is, generally speaking, an assistant U.S. attorney or a U.S. attorney, they will not take a case unless they are reasonably sure they can win it. So there's all sorts of cases that go by the wayside. The vast majority of federal, state, and local cases, criminal cases, are either dismissed, dropped, or pled out before there's any kind of a trial. So a trial is a pretty unusual thing,
Yeah,
unless it's a murder case or something like that, where the person is just, there's no upside for them to plead. They're just going to go to jail forever and ever. But for a case like this, cases I used to prosecute, not prosecute, but I would bring to a prosecutor, were frequently like border bust cases, not really complex investigations. These were just, Stephen Katowski shows up at the port of entry with 2 pounds of cocaine in the trunk, and we catch him, and then I interview him, and he goes to jail. And then if he goes to trial, we're going to charge him with possession of cocaine, transportation of cocaine, possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, and like 10 other things that all sound very similar to each other, because they
yeah,
are.
right.
So usually, and I would say, I don't think I've ever dealt with that particular charge. I'm sure I probably could have, but it never came up. It never occurred to us to charge somebody with that particular thing. But it would strike me, possession of, or prohibited possessor for narcotics use would strike me more as not even as a main charge, more of a lesser included kind of a thing. Like, it wouldn't be the
Yeah,
number one marquee charge on a charging sheet.
and that is according to some of the academics I spoke to about how this charge gets used in practice. And this is something that Hunter Biden's lawyers have claimed, that he's the only one who's ever been charged this way in Delaware. I don't know if that's true, but their basic argument is that he wouldn't be charged this way if he wasn't for his last name and politics
Uh-huh.
involved and all that. And to be fair, this kind of charge is rarely used on its own. It's usually a lesser included charge, or it's usually something that, like you just outlined there, it's much easier to prove than maybe dealing drugs but you can get somebody on this lesser charge. when you can't get them on what you really want to get them on, I guess is sort of the
Have him
idea.
plead to that lesser charge because it's it's a less
Yeah.
serious offense and there's less potential jail time or less of a fine.
At the
Smart money.
same time, though, there is that Daniels case that I mentioned from the Fifth Circuit where that's potentially going to make it to the Supreme Court soon. They haven't decided whether or not to take it yet, but that case again is just a guy who was found with a gun and marijuana in his car, and so it's not like it's never happened before,
Right.
or that less famous people don't get charged with this stuff. It's just there's some argument over would he have gotten charged this way otherwise. What should somebody who didn't actually commit any sort of violent crime with a gun while they were because that's what he's charged with, right? He's just charged with having a gun or lying on a background check about his drug use. He didn't actually all the things that he's done or been accused of doing. He did get charged with a bunch of tax crimes separately from this, but he was never charged of trying to rob anybody or shoot somebody or anything like that. And that's probably one of the reasons he's gotten a little bit of support from some gun rights groups over this. The Firearms Policy Coalition, maybe a bit tongue in cheek, offered to help him. I mean, I honestly think they probably would help him if he agreed to it, because they agree with the principle of the argument at hand in this case. And I will say too, there may be some more incentive for Biden to go to trial in this particular case on the gun stuff, at least if he can't work out some sort of deal to get all this, like he wanted to at the beginning, avoid jail time and all that stuff, if possible. If he can't get that, he may actually want to go to trial on these charges, just because the other thing that Bruin does is that it shifts the burden to the government. So this is why you've seen a lot of, like, the case in front of this court right now, Rahimi, that's just a regular criminal defendant who had a public defender as his lawyer, and it made it all the way to Supreme Court because I think in large part the burden when judges are set to decide these cases is supposed to be on the government to prove that there is a historical tradition of this kind of regulation. And so all you have to do as a defendant basically is say, we don't think there is, and then the government has to be the ones who go out and show that there is a tradition. And that can be hard with some of this stuff, even stuff that may be relatively popular today. These prohibitions on people addicted to drugs from owning guns, that may be a fairly popular policy. And you haven't seen a lot of political advocacy against the overall law itself. You've seen some on the marijuana aspects, because marijuana, I think people view that as a less serious drug, right? And it's much more popular drug, and it's been decriminalized in a lot of places, as you alluded to earlier. Whereas crack cocaine is obviously not viewed that way. But under the law and in these rulings that you've seen, which have come down on either side of this question in the lower courts, whether or not this law is constitutional, there's no distinction between marijuana and crack cocaine under this law. So his legal argument is as good as the one in Daniels that won. So maybe he does go to trial. Maybe he does risk it because the burden is on the government in that situation.
Yeah, very well could be. I mean, we could be looking at Hunter Biden, hero of the Second Amendment community. Wouldn't that be something?
It would
Who
be
knows?
something.